Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about the AEL or auto exposure lock button on the Olympus E-M5 Mark III. Now a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today will probably apply across many different camera systems and brands, and certainly across the Olympus and OM system cameras, but the question I got was specifically about the E-M5 Mark III. Alright, so here's the question that I got written from the viewer, and I'm going to interpret this the best I can, but I think what he's trying to do is to spot meter into the center of the frame on a particular subject and then lock that exposure and move the subject into another part of the frame. And the problem he's having is when he moves the subject away from the center of the frame, the camera changes the exposure back to whatever is now in the center of the frame. So let me just demonstrate very quickly. All right, so let's just do a quick full reset on the camera. And that way we're all on the same page. And basically what we want to do is change the camera to spot metering. So we'll go ahead and go down here. And we'll go to spot metering. So now the camera is exposing just for the center of the frame. And what's happening is he'll focus, half press the shutter button, and then he wants to move the subject to a different part of the frame. And you can see now that the camera is exposing for the center here and no longer on the subject. And all you really have to do is, once you've got the exposure that you want, so in this case I actually probably want this exposure plus a little bit of exposure comp in the positive direction. And then I'm going to lock this exposure. So I'm going to push the AEL button here on the back, the auto exposure lock. And you notice in the bottom left of the screen, you see a green AEL icon pop up, and that tells you that the exposure is now locked to these settings. So now when I move the car out of the way, you can see the exposure doesn't change. However, if I push the AEL button again, it'll toggle and turn it off. And you can see now it's again centering or metering here for the center. I can put this back and now we're good. I'm going to go ahead and lock the exposure. And then now I can move the subject to anywhere in the frame and the exposure won't change. Now in the E-M5 Mark III, by default, the spot metering exposure is tied to the focus point. So if I move that focus point around in the frame, it's going to meter and expose for that particular spot. So as you can see right now, the target point is right here in the center of the frame, and it's metering for the center. However, if I just simply move the target point around onto the vehicle like this, it will now meter for that spot wherever the target point is. And then from here, I can go ahead and just take the picture, or I can again lock the exposure by pushing the AEL button and take the picture this way, and then I can still move my subject around to any other spot, move my focus point to the new location, and because I have AEL or auto exposure lock set, the exposure is not going to change no matter where I move the vehicle. And then again, if I disable it by clicking the AEL button again, I can move the vehicle back into the spot to get the correct exposure, or I can just simply move my focus point over to the vehicle and take a picture. Now for some reason, if you don't want the spot metering to follow the focus point, you can delink the spot metering from the focus point in the menu. And that way the camera will always spot meter in the center. So what you do is you go into the menu and you go into the custom menu, go back to exposure, and you go into menu E3 in this case, go down to spot metering, and just uncheck the 3 different spot metering modes. And now the camera will only meter in the center, and you can see there's a little circle here indicating that the camera is in spot metering mode, and it's only going to meter here in the center. So if I move my focus point around, you'll see the exposure does not change like it was before. However, if I actually move the vehicle out of the way, you can see that the camera is metering only in this little circle here. Even my finger changes the exposure just a little bit. And then of course the AEL button still works, so I can put the car in the center, put the auto exposure lock on, and then now wherever I move the car, it doesn't matter. And of course, even when I move the focus point, it's not going to make any difference. Now there are a lot of other exposure setting and modes that I'm not going to get into. even though they are sort of indirectly related to the AEL or auto exposure lock feature. But I do want to point out something that may interfere with the workflow or the things that I've showed you up to this point. If you're not starting, say, from a full reset, there's a setting in the camera that is kind of not so intuitive that can affect how the AEL button works. All right, so let's go into the menu, and first let's check the button menu and make sure that the AEL button has not been reassigned. So we'll go down here to AEL function and click over to the right. And you want to make sure this says AEL AFL, because you can assign this to do different things. So in this case, I assigned it to be the white balance function. So just click over to the right and then scroll up and down until you see AEL AFL. And AFL stands for autofocus lock, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Now the next place you want to check is in the autofocus menu, and this is what I mean by it's not very intuitive in this case, right? So we'll go down here and go to the AEL AFL. And what this does is it tells the camera what to do when you push the AEL button, depending on what focusing mode you're in. So let's start with SAF or single autofocus. We'll click over to the right. If you look below mode 1, it tells you what's going to happen when you halfway press the shutter button, when you fully press the shutter button, and when you push the AEL button. So if we half press the shutter button, it's going to lock the exposure and start the autofocus. When you fully press the shutter button, it's going to take the picture or do the exposure, in other words. And the AEL button is assigned to do auto exposure lock. Now if we go to mode 2, you'll see that now when you halfway press the shutter button, it's only going to start the autofocus. Fully pressing the shutter button will lock the exposure and take the picture. And then the AEL button is still doing the same thing, it's just auto locking the exposure. However, if you go to mode 3, you'll notice that halfway pressing the shutter button has swapped with the AEL button. So now half pressing the shutter button will toggle the auto exposure lock, and the AEL button will actually start the autofocus. So this is what a lot of people do for when they want to do back button focusing. All right, so let's put this into mode 1, and then we'll do the same thing for CAF. Let's see what they have in here. For CAF, it's default to mode 2. So half pressing starts the autofocusing action. Fully pressing the shutter button will lock the exposure, lock the focus, and take the picture. And the AEL button will lock the exposure. Mode 3, you can see that this is sort of the back button focus mode, where half pressing the shutter button locks the exposure, fully pressing locks the focus and the exposure and takes the picture. And then the AEL button is actually starts the autofocus. So this is a back button focus mode. And then mode 4 disables half pressing the button, so that when you fully push the shutter button, basically it takes the picture, and the AEL button is again still acting as your back button focus. And then we have mode 1, which is very similar to the SAF mode, where half pressing can lock the exposure and start the autofocus. Fully pressing takes the picture, locks the focus, and then the AEL button is acting normally. But we can leave this on default mode 2. And then for manual focus, half pressing is auto exposure lock. We also have a mode 2 that disables half pressing the shutter button. And then mode 3, where we go into a back button focus situation, where even if you're in manual focus mode, you can tell the camera to focus by pushing the AEL button. And then one more thing I want to mention here is whenever you have the halfway press shutter button set to AEL mode, it's only going to lock the exposure for as long as you're half pressing the shutter button. As soon as you release the shutter button, the camera's going to go back to whatever exposure metering mode that you have set. So it's not like a toggle like the AEL button is. It only is active when you're half pressing the shutter button. So let's go ahead and put this back into mode 1, which was the default setting. So that's basically how the AEL or auto exposure button works, and it's a very powerful tool to use, especially in conjunction with the spot metering function. And it's commonly used in very high dynamic range scenes where you maybe have some very, very bright areas or very, very dark areas that can confuse the camera's automatic exposure, and you want to make sure that you get your subject properly exposed by spot metering on the subject, locking that exposure, and then taking the picture. And that's all I have for today, and if you'd like to support what I do here, you can make a small donation in the links below or become a member of the channel. Either way, it's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.